Welcome to our lecture on environmental justice. Environmental justice is really important because when we're talking about resource management and the distribution of resources, who gets to make resource decisions and who doesn't, who ends up with the burden of pollution and destruction of resources and access to resources, that's when we start to talk about this notion of justice and the unequitable systems that have been in place for a very long time. This is not new. But there has been moves over the last 50 years to try and do something about it, at least in the United States. There are other places around the world that are also doing this, but we can look within the United States, we can look within California, but we can also look globally and ask ourselves, who has an excess burden of environmental impacts and why? How did they end up having all the pollution, all the destroyed resources in their communities? And how did other communities manage not to have any of that? So our journey today is going to be through the area of environmental justice. All right. So the first thing we want to talk about is policy, because policy is what ends up dictating who has access to what resources, who gets to make decisions about how resources are used, who doesn't, and why those people have that power. So let's first talk a little bit about policy. So a policy is a set of ideas or plans of what to do within a particular situation that has been agreed upon, has been agreed to officially by a group of people, business organizations, a government, or a political party. So let's think about that. This is a policy, is a plan or an idea or a choice of action, could also be included in that is agreed upon by a group of people. Who gets to be in that group of people is a very important question. When we look at all the ancient civilizations, it's the king, it's the king's advisors, it's the elites of society. And while we don't have a king here in the United States, we definitely have a stratified society where a much smaller group of people get to make a lot of these decisions, and the rest of us don't. We get to have the impacts of these decisions. So when we have a policy, all policies are decisions about resources. It is a decision about what to do with whatever it is we're considering. So when we talk about policy, we talk about manifest and latent policy. So manifest, this term manifest, this all comes from the work of Emile Durkheim. He coined the terms manifest and latent. He is a sociologist, and he was talking about social structures in society and how they function and why they exist and what happens when they don't exist and why don't some things exist and why do some things go away. So Emile Durkheim has coined a lot of this. So when we talk about this idea around policy, we can talk about manifest and latent. So manifest are the recognizes and intended consequences of a policy. So I am going to allow company X to mine copper and gold out of this one location. That is a policy. That is a series of resource decisions. But it can also be something like, I am going to choose to increase taxes on people to help pay for road improvement. Well, who's going to pay those taxes? Individuals that are driving on the road. We're going to put them through gas tax. So people that drive cars that are gas powered are going to pay taxes to help road maintenance, which was perfectly equal. Everybody who drove a car had to pay gas tax because historically everybody had gas powered cars. Electric vehicles were not common. Well, electric vehicles are becoming more common. And so now we're asking the decision, hey, what about all those Teslas out there? They're not using gas. They're not paying for gas tax. So they're not paying for the roads. how do we get those people to pay for the roads? That is actually a conversation about resources that California is having today, is how do we ensure that people that are, everybody using the roads, are paying for the road maintenance, which is a good thing. I mean, nobody wants to drive over potholes and destroyed roads and things like that. Another policy decision that has come up yet again, speaking of roads, is what do we do with the stretch of Highway 1 between the Hearst Castle and Big Sur that is constantly collapsing? Is it worth it for us to continue to pay money for this road that every time there's even the thought of rain, it falls off into the ocean? Should we continue to invest in this resource? Who should be paying for this? And if we don't rebuild this road, what should we do? Should we move it? Should we just say, screw it, jump on 101? Is there some other alternative? That is a policy decision. That is a manifest policy decision, right? So the consequences that people see, observe, or expect, right? So these are obvious things. Latent is the unrecognized or unintended consequences. So when we put the gas tax into place back in the 1980s, everybody drove gas-powered cars. Well, over time, that's changed. So this is a latent consequence. There is a group of people that aren't paying gas tax. Well, when we wrote the policy, that wasn't a thing, but now it is. So there's a group of people that are benefiting from the rest of us paying road taxes, gas taxes. So that is an unintended or unexpected or not explicitly stated or recognized consequence of the policy. So a policy is functional if it has an overall positive impact. Like I said, nobody likes driving on potholed roads, so having us pay for them, that's what we do. That's how that works. Also, it is not viable for everybody to have to build their own roads, right? We come together and we create roads that we all can use and we all pay for them. So a little bit of socialism going on there. Our roadways are socialist. Socialism is where we, the collective, pay our part for the use of this common resource. A policy is considered dysfunctional if it has an overall negative impact. So that copper and gold mine example, that's great for the company who gets the gold and the copper. They're going to make a lot of money. But as we learned when we talked about mining, we talked about mining in Montana, we read about it in Australia, we talked about it in Appalachia, and it's not that we don't use copper, and it's not that we don't use gold, and it's not that we don't need those things, right? Like that is a thing. We need those things. We use those things. They're in a lot of our electronics. They're the wiring for all of our houses and things like that. But the communities, but there's not a policy. There's not in place in a lot of locations policies that say, all right, dudes, you made all the money off this. Now you got to clean it up. Here in California, we have a lot of oil wells. We have been an oil producing state. We often don't think about it, but even here in San Luis Obispo County, there are oil wells, oil and gas wells. Well, when those oil and gas wells run out, what do you do with them? Well, all over this country, there are tens of thousands of abandoned wells that just are sitting out there. They haven't been capped, they haven't been closed, they're not safe, they're leaking methane and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. They're not being monitored because we didn't have any policies that said, hey, yo, when this well is empty, you got to fix it. There is a whole big thing going on with Exxon and Chevron right now in the state of California, because California does have a law that says, hey, yo, you have to take care of this now. This law has been in place for about 5 years. That's it, 5 years, 5 years of capping. So those original policies that just allowed companies to do what they were going to do. When they were done, go out of business, and nobody's responsible for the cleanup except for the community that it's impacted. That is a dysfunctional policy. That has a negative impact. So it's important for us to understand some of these terms. When we think of policies and resource management is done through policy. So we talk about manifest and latent intended consequences, and we talk about functional and dysfunctional policies. So I also want to introduce to you two other terms. We're going to do a lot of terms actually in this lecture. Well, and three other terms. So when we talk about policies and who it does and does not impact, we can also talk about justice. But before we talk about justice, we need to talk about equity versus equality. Because this is why we engage in social justice. These are the drivers of social justice. All right. So both of these terms, both of these ideas are important. So we often talk about this idea of equality. Equality is important. Equality is when each individual or group of people is given the exact same resources. And there are examples when equality is really important. Everybody should have the right to vote. We do not have a good history on that here in the United States. Matter of fact, when we started this country, after the Constitution was ratified, only 25% of people in this country actually have the right to vote. We have gotten better about it, but we certainly have a lot of barriers that are in the way to equality around voting. We would also really like to have equality under the law, right? Everybody has equal access to an unbiased judicial system, which means that you have to have unbiased law enforcement, unbiased laws. We have lots of laws that are biased in this country. We have a criminal justice system that has a butt ton of research that shows that it is also incredibly biased, especially towards those who are melanated, and that means you have darker skin, and those who are poor. And then you have the intersection of those things coming together. We know that individuals who are minority or who are poor are more likely to be over-policed. They're more likely to, that means they're targeted for policing. They're more likely to be considered suspicious. They're more likely to have encounters with the police, and the more encounters with police you have, the more likely it is that you are going to be arrested. When you're arrested, you're less likely to have money for bail. You're less likely to have money for a lawyer, so you're more likely to need a public defender. Public defenders tend to be underpaid and overworked. So the quality of your legal representation is going to be a lot lower than if you have, I don't know, a few $1,000,000 to pay your lawyers. You're going to get much better legal representation in the courts, even if you did exactly the same crime. We know that individuals who have less quality lawyers are more likely to have harsher sentences. They're more likely to have to serve all of those sentences, as opposed to getting probation, parole, or to have a shorter sentence. And they're more likely to have issues reintegrating after they serve their time. So it's all the way through the whole structure. Now, equality means everybody gets equal, but there's lots of situations where we don't all need exactly the same thing. And that's where this idea of equity comes in. Equity recognizes that each person or group has different circumstances, and it allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. So if the equal outcome is there's nobody living in a state of poverty, that seems like a pretty good goal, right? Like, we're the richest country on the planet. Why do we have people that don't have running water and electricity and their homes are falling down? Like, why is that a thing? Why do we have homeless people? Like, we're the richest country on the planet. Why are there homeless people? We certainly have the housing stock that is empty where we could house these people. And we spend billions and billions of dollars on our military, yet we have a huge veterans population that's unemployed, that's homeless. Why is that? And that's where equity comes in. So I'm going to tell you a little story about equity. So my son that's not related to homeless vets or the criminal justice system. So my son is a musician and he is a cellist. He takes lessons with a cello teacher who has quite a few students of all different ages. She teaches kids that are 5 to adults that are in their 30s and 40s. And her cello students are of all different capabilities. So my son has been playing cello for 6 years, and is, definitely an intermediate cellist. He's not advanced. You don't get to be advanced for a while. Cello is a hard instrument to master. So she has beginners and then she has very advanced students. One of her students recently won a international competition in cello performance. And so, yeah, very, very talented cellist. So for her students who and every year there are 2 different performances. Everybody performs it. Like everybody comes to the recital and everybody performs their song. And yes, we hear lots of different versions of Lightly Row, which is a beginner song. And everybody has their own version of it. And some are beginners that are good, and some are beginners that they're beginners. But she has some kids that are really little and some kids that need support. And so for those kids, she has a chair where she will go sit up on stage to just kind of be there for them. And for the beginners, you're actually not allowed to have music. So you have to memorize your piece. They're not that long. There are some kids that need to bring their stuffed animal up with them, and they need their stuffy support, and they do great, and we all clap, and we're all very proud, and we're all very proud of their stuffy for giving them support. And then we have some kids who don't need a stuffed animal, and they can just get up there and they just rock out their song, how good or bad it was, and we are all proud and we all clap for them, and they are good. And each one of those kids got what they needed in order to perform their recital. So when my son goes up there, he's a teen now, but the only time that his teacher is up on the stage is if they're performing a duet. Otherwise, he's up there by himself. He and his music. His music's like 4 or 5 pages long at this point. So he gets to bring his music up there. But the teacher's not up there. He doesn't need that kind of support. So this is figuring out, what does everybody need in order to be able to perform their piece? Some kids need support. Some kids don't. Some kids need a stuffy and some kids don't. Some kids need their parents to sit up in the front and just play to them, and some kids don't. Some kids need it to be really quiet and some kids don't. Some kids get really nervous and they just take a long time to get through their piece, and we are all sitting there with bated breath, not making faces because they're hitting wrong notes. God love them. And we're really proud of them. And they just needed that time, and we give them that space. And that's equity. Everybody has different needs, and we figure out what are the resources and opportunities needed to allow those people to have an equal outcome. And so examples are, the cello example is an example of education. This is music education. But we can think through all education, right? Like, some of you are really good public speakers and some of you are not. And that's part of the reason why I have you do recorded presentations. So there's not as much pressure for those who are terrified of public speaking, but you all still get an opportunity to do public speaking, right? You're just doing it through video. That's why I give multiple types of assignments. Some of it's listening to a podcast or watching a video, some of it's reading, some of it's writing. So giving each of you different opportunities to play with the strengths and build up the weaknesses you have, right? That's good education. We can think through economics as well, right? Not everybody, there was a point in time where the idea of a minimum wage was the minimum amount of money that one person needed to make in order to have the basics of life for a family of 4. If minimum wage had, by the way, kept up with the cost of living in the state of California, it'd be $24 an hour. And that was the idea behind minimum wage. It was the minimum wage that you needed in order to pay rent, get food, transportation, all of your utilities, and have a little bit left over. That was the idea. We know from a number of studies, when we give people who are struggling a minimum basic income, it's transformational for them. It's transformational. And so it allows them to not be homeless. It allows them to pay their bills and eat and buy their medicine, right? Like all three of those things at the same time. Sounds crazy, but it's not. And so when we think through economics, it's not that everybody needs to be a billionaire. There's a whole economic theory out there, by the way, that billionaires shouldn't exist to begin with, because that's an overconsumption of resources. And so that is the idea of equity. It's where barriers are taken away that might have inhibited people from achieving a particular outcome, or resources are provided that allow them to be able to achieve that outcome. It is not about just randomly gifting things to people, by the way. It's saying that we want the standard to be X. What does everybody need to get there? All right. Because we have a stratified social system, we also talk about different types of justice. So I was just talking about this stratified society and around notions of equity and equality and how justice might play into that. But let's talk about, how do you know if your system is stratified? So stratified social systems, which you know about because we looked at ancient civilizations, is where we have different social categories of people who tend to share common characteristics without necessarily interacting or identifying with each other. So this is a process of being ranked. And this process of being ranked comes along a lot of different levels. We can think of it from ascribed or achieved characteristics. So ascribed characteristics are the social categories that society puts upon you. So these are ones we often think of, right? So gender, this gender identity, what it means to be masculine or feminine, means to be male or female. We tend, and most societies tend, to have a binary gendered system. But there are a lot of societies that don't have a binary gendered system. There are some societies that have had up to 6 or 7 different genders. And engaging with those other gender options has its different stratifications in different places in society. We are actually, by the way, moving towards a non-binary gendered system. We are moving towards a multiple gendered system. But this can also be things like race, family relations, things that you didn't necessarily choose, right? Who your parents are, what country, what community that you were born into. Those are characteristics that were ascribed to you. And then we have characteristics that you can achieve. So right now, you're sitting here watching this lecture, you are college student. That is an achieved characteristic. It means that you have moved through the K through 12 system and you are in college. You have achieved the status of college student. And the gods willing, sooner rather than later, you will achieve the status of college graduate, because you will have finished your college education and you will now be college graduate. Examples of achieved status, in addition to educational status, are employment, whatever your job title is, choosing to be married, that's a choice that you're making. So your opportunities in your life depend upon your social categories. So we have these things called role expectations, and these are the role or opportunities you're expected to do based on a particular status. And And this can be in terms of opportunities and barriers. So remember, we're talking about broader social systems. We're talking about systems. So there's always going to be the, yeah, but so-and-so did X. Yep, they're the exception to the rule. So systems put policies, laws, rules, norms, values in place to tell you what you're expected to do based on your social characteristics. So people's life experiences and opportunities depend upon their social category. It is much harder to achieve the status of college student if you can't afford college. It's harder to achieve the status of college student if there is no college around you to attend. So you have to travel somewhere. And if you're lower socioeconomic status, can you afford that? By the way, being poor is expensive, much more expensive than having even middle class. So certain individuals lack barriers in their way that open up opportunities to them that aren't necessarily open to others. And then because we have these ranks of different social categories, they change slowly over time. So we have seen these changes. They occur, I know the slide says frequently, but it's a bit slower, right? So in the Declaration of Independence, we decided we weren't going to be a monarchy anymore. We kicked out the king. See the Hamilton musical for details. And then we wrote this into law, right? Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says no title of nobility should be granted. We're getting rid of the aristocracy. It's not just the monarchy, but this whole idea of lords and viscountesses and things like that that are entitled through birth to have things. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. We abolished this notion of slavery. And then the 14th Amendment granted African-American men citizenship of the United States. By the way, at the time, no woman was a citizen legally. The 15th Amendment ended suffrage based on race, although women still couldn't vote. The 19th Amendment ends the government's recognizes women's suffrage. And then, of course, the Civil Rights Act is supposed to end segregation, right? We are trying to put policies into place that help us have a more equitable and equal society. But we're not always there. And to get to these places, we have to engage in types of justice. So when we talk about this notion of justice, we usually break it down into several layers. So in a legal sense, the idea of justice is equality, right? Coming up with equal access under the law. We can also think of justice as being moral rightness or righteous, and being able to really stand up for these principles where everybody has access, right? Breaking down barriers, everybody gets equitability and equality. Now, when we talk about justice, we usually, for the purposes of this class, we have social justice, environmental justice, and eco-justice as three distinct types of justice that we are interested in when we talk about resources. So the idea of social justice is about humans and human social stratification. It is examining the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privilege. And I want to talk about these notions real quick. So we have a lot of terms and ideas that are used, like white privilege, male privilege, things along those lines. They're very triggering for some people. But I want you to think of privilege in terms of social stratification. You can look at who is in a position of power. If you were to stop this right now and you were to go look at US Congress, who is in the Senate, who is in the House, and who is in the White House? So right now in the 118th Congress, we have about 28% of the House of Representatives that identify as a minority, a racial minority. If we compare this to the 79th Congress in 1945, there was one person in that Congress. Now, women make up 51% of the US population, right? So if we were equally shown and represented in Congress, we would represent 51% of the representatives. Well, Congress is at an all-time high of women. The House of Representatives is 28%, half of what a just society would look like, because it would be representative of the population. And the Senate has 25%. So there's 25 women, not 50%, not 51%, 28 and 25%. Who gets to make the laws? People in Congress. Whose voices are being heard? The people in Congress. They're the ones whose priorities get put into law. So it's a good change. Don't get me wrong, we're moving in the right direction, but it's certainly not representative in terms of who has these opportunities, whose priorities get placed in positions of power, who has access to wealth, right? And so when we talk about this idea of privilege, we can look at social structures and ask, who gets to make the decisions? Who are in those decision-making positions? Now, you may be sitting here in your chair going, well, I'm not in that position. Okay, well, first of all, you could be. You absolutely could go run for Congress. And I mean that for all of you. Go run for something. Go get involved in the political process. Yes, please. Yes to all of you. Please go do that. But when you look historically at who has these access to power, if you weren't even considered a citizen, you didn't have access to, you didn't have say in the making of the laws. And if you didn't have the ability to own things, there's a very long history in the United States of women not being able to own things. We weren't allowed to own houses. We weren't allowed to take out debt. We weren't allowed to purchase cars. And I'm talking in like the 1980s, women still struggled to access their own credit cards, right? Having buy a house on their own. Like this is something that was going on. It was illegal before 1973, I think it was, for a woman to take out a bank loan without a male signatory. I want you to think about that for a second. Like your parents, their generation couldn't take your grandparents, sorry, your grandma wasn't legally able to purchase a house without a male relative signing off for her. Even if she was the one making all the money, even if she was the one paying all the bills, she was not legally allowed to have that. So that is privilege when you can have access to those things. We put up barriers and obstacles for women to be able to own property. Well, and that has an impact because we know intergenerational wealth is incredibly important in order to help maintain a population. So your parents' ability to own a house often is influenced by your grandparents' ability to own a house, because oftentimes when your grandparents pass, they'll give your parents money, and then that will allow them to purchase a house, or they'll be able to help out. So social justice is about creating opportunities and removing barriers, social barriers, from people in order to allow them to be more equitable and equal. Within that, we talk about environmental justice. So fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people with regards to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So if you're going to be impacted by something directly or indirectly, shouldn't you have a say in that? Most of us don't. Very few of us have the time. Time is an incredibly important resource, by the way, to go to every single zoning meeting and every single city council meeting and every single business meeting that is out there. We just don't physically have that kind of time. But there are people who do, by the way, that do have that kind of time, and their input is absolutely heard into the policies around zoning and things like that. And so when we think through this idea of environmental justice, it's asking what humans are being impacted, who gets to have a say in the policies in their community. And we will talk about a whole host of policies that people have not had a chance to have a say in the rest of this lecture. And then we talk about eco-justice, and this is the notion of non-humans having a moral right to distributive justice, including their share of the environmental resources. Here in California, we have a lot of issues around water. We just had a whole thing that we did on agriculture not that long ago. What if the fish, what if the salmon had the same rights to water that the farmers in the Central Valley have? I want you to think about how that shifts our decision-making process. What if the rivers have a right to exist as they naturally are? What does that do for our resource choices? Can we be growing very thirsty crops in the middle of an arid area? Probably not. Should we be growing crops in the middle of an arid area? That's an important question. I know I love almonds. I love pistachios. I have horses. They eat alfalfa. Trust me, I understand the arguments around having those resources and being economically viable and needing food and things about that, like that. But as you learned in our video about fish are $1 billion industry, and they don't have the same rights. I want you to think about how that shifts the conversation, is if the natural environment had rights. So this idea of eco-justice is the principle of being just or equitable with respect to ecological sustainability and the protection of the environment, as well as social and economic issues, right? It's not just who gets to have priority. What if we all have equal priority? In order to really engage in this idea of eco-justice, you have to understand that local and global ecosystems are essential to life. And what happens in California impacts what happens in Africa. And what happens in China impacts California. We get a lot of their air pollution coming across the ocean, right? What's going on in China is impacting you here now. We are in a closed ecosystem. It's a big one. It looks huge. We don't often think about it, but we are in a closed ecosystem. This also requires us to challenge deep cultural assumptions underlying modern thinking around these systems, right? Like, this requires us to radically shift how we think about the use of resources. Mother Nature, by the way, is forcing us to do that now, right? Climate change has gotten to the point where, yeah, we're going to have to rethink this because Mother Nature is kind of over us. And then there's a recognition of the need to restore common and environmental commons, right? So this idea of cultural and environmental commons that everyone should have access. That is another very important notion going on in here. All right, so environmental justice is what we call an intersectionality. So remember I talked about all those ascribed and achieved statuses that make up the social hierarchy. Your opportunities in society are where all of those things meet together. And there's a lot of them. And we don't really think about ascribed statuses or achieved statuses where we happen to be in the dominant group. One of the things in my journey as a sociologist that I have become a lot more aware of is disability. I have a number of friends, a growing number of friends who have disabilities, and all the structural impediments that are in play, both for those who are physically disabled, but also those that have mental disabilities as well. And the types and lacks of support for those people, how that works. I mean, I have a friend who has issues walking, and there are so many places she can't access because the ramps are in the middle of nowhere. Like, you have to walk extra far to get to the disability ramps to get into buildings. We see this here even at Cal Poly, where imagine not being able to walk up hills. Like you physically can't walk up hills. So you have to wait for disability services to come pick you up and take you where you're going to go. And that could take a minute, right? Or you have to have some other mode of transportation other than your 2 feet to get around. And then how do you get around inside buildings in that? So when you walk around campus, like that's an important thing, right? So you have all of these layers, and we often don't even think about our positions when we're in the dominant position because they're the default position. We just lack awareness of the barriers and lack of opportunities that happen in those places. So the need for environmental justice is an intersection. And so when we talk about intersectionality and justice and injustice, right, this notion of not equitable, unequal, unequitable distribution, we can talk in terms of 3 things. We talk in terms of intergenerational injustice. So this is the idea of whether present generations are duty-bound around considerations of justice to those in the future. So what is our obligation? What is my obligation to you as Gen Zs and me as a Gen X, right? There's more Gen Xers in positions of power. There's more of us that have money and stability. What is our obligation to make sure you have a stable planet? That's an important question to both of us, by the way, because my kids are Gen Z. So what is my obligation to my kids? What is my obligation to the grandkids that I may or may not have in the future, but that generation, the Gen Alphas, right? Those are the kids being born now. I don't know what we're going to call the generation after them. I'm just going to call them betas. What is our obligation to the betas? The Gen betas are going to be born in the 2030s. Those are your kids. What is our obligation to them? To have a planet that's not on fire, that has fish in the ocean and arable land, and every day isn't a heat wave. What is our obligation to them? And then what is our obligation around past injustices, right? There are communities who have an overburden of environmental degradation. What is our obligation to them? That's a really important question. And then we have socioeconomic justice. Like I was just talking about before, time is a valuable resource. I hear this phrase that we're all on the we're all on the same ship. We are not all on the same ship. We are all in the same storm. Some people are on aircraft carriers who barely feel the storm. Some people are on luxury cruise liners. Some people are on luxury yachts. Some people are floating in the water. They don't even have a life vest. They're just floating in the water. How do we get everybody on a raft? Who gets to pay for the raft? What is our obligation for the unequitable distribution of wealth that is impact most people's lives, right? And then, of course, we have geographic justice. So this is the uneven distribution of environmental degradation and pollution within a country and across the globe. And the video that I mentioned, what 3 degrees of global warming looks like, really addresses the idea that a lot of people who are being impacted significantly by climate change are people that have zero contribution to creating carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They are not burning fossil fuels. So those are really important questions that we need to ask about injustice. So economic environmental injustice, when we think about it, this is a community in Pennsylvania. I want you to look at this community. Here are people's houses. They are a block away. This is a steel mill. They're a block away from a steel mill. And when you think about what their environment is like, what is their soil like? What is their air like? What is their water quality like? What do they have access to? Sorry, this is in Pittsburgh. I want you to think about what their property values are like. If grandma bought this house here, right? This is a house. If grandma bought this house here and it is depreciated because of the impact of this industry, that family has lost generational wealth. Who decided this steel mill should be here? Who decided this house should be here? How did that come about? By the way, a lot of these communities were built up as zones of transition where immigrants would come in, work in these factories, and then make enough money and move out, and the next generation would come in. Well, in the 1960s and 1970s, we saw that trend that had been going on for about 100 years start to stop. And we see communities being trapped in these areas of economic injustice. So economic environmental injustice tends to target communities that are low income, have high unemployment rates, have lower education rates, and have very high youth or senior levels. Both of those populations have less income. These people have less social and economic power to influence policy decisions. And that's because their time has to be used differently than people that have more economic resources. Again, this is the same thing of we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. If you have to commute to work in order to have your job, how are you getting there? What is your time like when say you have an hour commute to work, an hour commute back? Are you on public transit? Are you dependent upon public transit being on time? Has public transit been invested in properly where it's on time? Is it convenient to get to? Do you have to drive? How long does that drive take? Do you have the financial resources to maintain your transportation, right? So if you're driving a car, you need to have the time and the money to be able to pay for tires and oil changes and fixing things and pay for your insurance and gas and all of those sorts of things. Do you have the money to do that? That money is built up on how much you make an hour. A lot of places have a minimum wage of $7.25, and literally nobody can pay rent on $7.25 anywhere in the United States. So don't think leaving California and moving to Texas or Alabama or Missouri is going to help you. It's not. Their minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, and you still can't pay rent. Communities tend to have more mobility. These communities tend to have more mobility. Remember, I was talking about the immigrants coming in and out. You're more likely to have to move around from place to place to place. And so you just lack social networks and social cohesions to actually do something about a problem. There is often long histories of exploitation in these communities. And then all resource injustices basically boil down to economic injustice. So these communities often suffer from what we call social disorganization. This is another social theory. So this is a social theory. It actually comes from criminology, but it definitely applies to environmental injustice as well. We really see this start to come about in 1925 with two theorists named Parks and Burgess, who were doing some urban ecology and proposed that cities are environments like those found in nature. Who knew? 100 years ago, we're talking about how urban environments are like nature. And a lot of those environments are governed through both cooperation and competition. And that this creates desirable and undesirable places to live because of the resources in those communities. Now, communities that struggle with social disorganization are communities that don't have the ability to come together as a community to achieve shared goals or to solve jointly experienced problems. And this is because you just don't get to know your neighbor, a lot of residential instability. you lack commonalities, or you lack the ability or desire to find commonalities across your community. So there's a lot of diversity in communities. Diversity is not a bad thing if you can come together collectively to find a common goal, by the way. There are communities that tend to have higher family disruptions, especially single parents. That's because single parents have to work more. They have to spend more time by themselves making money and also raising the kids, so they don't have as much time to engage, to create shared values and community to solve problems. And then, of course, poverty. How vulnerable a community is to environmental factors really depends upon how well they can advocate for themselves. There's a lot of research on urban areas, and this is also a factor in rural communities as well. Who gets to have the garbage transfer station in their community? Who gets to have the bus hub? Who gets to have the train hub? Who gets to have the smelter or the garbage incinerator? The answer basically is often the same community because they lack the ability to advocate for themselves. Another part of this is what we call environmental racism. So racism is a huge factor socially, globally, locally, internationally. Racism is a factor. There is a ton of research. Go take any class on race, class, and gender anywhere. Go take an intro to social class. They'll go into all the details on this. Racism is a thing. It is real. It happens. It has real effects on people's lives and on people's communities. And we know that communities of color are much more likely to have eco-justice and environmental justice issues because they have lacked access to power since 1614. I mean, like they just have lacked access to power. And because they lack access to power, they tend to live in economic factors. They tend to live in communities that are more socially disorganized. It is harder for them to collectively advocate for themselves. So they are much more likely to be communities that end up with toxic facilities. So for instance, there is a study called Fumes Across the Fence Line, and this is done by the Clean Air Task Force and NAACP, that found that Black people are 75% more likely to live on a so-called fence line. These are communities that are next to industrial facilities that release toxic pollutants, including formaldehyde, and a whole bunch of other things, which are more likely to be linked to cancer and brain damage and lung problems and birth defects, and just have a whole bunch of pollutant issues. And these communities are much more likely to be burdened. This is also true for Indigenous communities, for immigrant communities, for Latinx communities, and communities that are predominant of single women. And that is because there is a long, long history of denying access to basic clean environmental resources along racial lines. So communities of color have been exposed to a lot of these because when we talk about social hierarchies, they were considered disposable. They are not as worthy as predominant communities. And the laws have limited their access to resources, including wealth. If you have a history of your family enslaved, and then a history of your family living in under Jim Crow laws and not having access to the ballot box and not being able to live in prosperous communities, or when you do have a prosperous community, it gets destroyed. See the Tulsa and Wilmington race riots for examples of Black communities being destroyed that were very successful. And you don't have those access to intergenerational wealth, you are caught in a cycle of inequality and a lack of access and barriers to creating wealth. And some of these are manifest policies. Remember, we talked about latent and manifest policies. We have a long history in this country of having manifest policies that says people of color can't live here. People that don't fit can't live here. And so we've grouped minorities in specific communities. And then we've done things like stuck highways through these communities. Unequal European immigrants also experienced these policies. There was a time where Irish and German and Italian immigrants were definitely not considered white people. They were Irish and Italian and German immigrants. They were less than, and they were absolutely part of these manifest policies. We have things like the Japanese Exclusion Act, and the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese internment camps that also strip out a lot of access to policy. These are manifest policies in the United States. Also, if you're throwing migrants in cages, that is a policy of exclusion. That is just a few years ago that we were doing that. And because these communities have explicit manifest policies, but there's also a whole bunch of latent policies that overburden them with pollution, those communities tend to also have a lot more health issues around this. And so this disproportionate victimization by environmental hazards has impacted the livelihoods and the intergenerational wealth of these communities. And they're more likely to die from environmental causes. They're more likely to have shortened lives. They're more likely to have cancer. They're also less likely to have access to healthcare. There's a lot of research around racial biases within the medical system, both in terms of access, and then once you have access, believability. Like, this is, again, a very long history. We see this along gendered lines as well. Women complaining about pain or discomfort were considered hysterical, and it was all in your mind, even if you had endometriosis or things like that. And that brings us to environmental sexism. Remember, we're talking about structural inequalities. So gender inequality and unequal access of women to land, natural resources, and other assets have constrained our ability to deal with climate and environmental crises and disasters, and to fully enjoy their environments. And this, again, is based in historical and current marginalization of women and other genders. We have manifest policies that have limited access to social, political, and economic rights, to holding a job, to, like I've talked about some of this already. Women and children are much more likely to die than men in natural and man-made disasters, and much less likely to have the resources to recover. So when we're talking about disaster planning, we talked about the fact that you have to have the ability to recover. A lot of women, especially female single-headed households, don't have the resources to recover from an environmental disaster. And it could be things as simple as, I don't have the money to fix my leaky roof, and it rains and my house becomes damaged, and then it becomes full of black mold, and that black mold is toxic. And now me and my children are living in a toxic environment because I didn't have the money to fix my roof. Like, it's little things like that. Leaky pipe. There's a leaky pipe in my wall, and I don't have the money to call a plumber to dig out the wall and replace the pipe. I do not have the knowledge or resources myself to go purchase a pipe and do it myself, because that actually takes a number of tools that you have to have. And if you don't have the resources to get those tools, then you don't have the resources to get those tools, and you just have leaky pipes. Women in the US had to give all resources to their husband for a very long time. So that limited their access to intergenerational wealth as well. And then less than 20% of land in the world is actually owned by women. So when we talk about global statistics, women make up 51% of the population and own less than 20% of the land. And this, of course, results in women's livelihoods take longer to recover from economic and climate shocks, because we just don't have access to those resources. There are a lot of other intersections that we can talk about. We've talked about economic, race, and gender, but we can talk about a whole host of other things that are out there that lead to this. This is not a comprehensive list. There are tons of other intersectionalities that can come into play that can impact your access to resources. And there's a lot of environmental consequences. So the United States oil and gas industry releases about 9 million tons of methane and other toxic chemicals into the atmosphere. Minority, women-headed households and lower income communities are much more likely to be impacted by air pollution. More than 1 million African Americans alone live within a half mile of a natural gas facility. And Over 1 million African Americans face cancer risks because of the EPA's level of concern due to unclean air. Air is important. This is the old picture of LA, by the way. But we have laws that have helped with this a lot. We have also experienced a lot of deregulation the last 40 years, starting under Ronald Reagan, where he started to roll back a lot of the clean air and clean water and clean land regulations, which have actually increased pollutions in the environment. Chemical waste, another good example. We manufacture all of these things. Where does all the waste product go? Which communities get that? In 2023, there was the East Palestine oil spill or chemical spill. We were still not sure what the hell was in that water, but the follow-up with that community shows that it's their land is still very much polluted. One of the cleanup was they dug up like 3 feet of soil around the train tracks and took it away. Where did it go? Whose community did it end up in? It didn't leave planet Earth. It didn't go into space. It went somewhere else. Lead exposure, not as much of a problem today as it was historically, although we still have a lot of lead pipes in a lot of communities. So yeah, there's still a lot of lead exposure. Water contamination, especially in the West, as we have cycles of drought, we pull out extra groundwater, huge problems. And then of course, climate change. There is a really great map. I'm going to pull this up for us. That maps out all the different places, right? So here we are in San Luis Obispo. I don't have anything turned on. So we can look at environmental justice indexes, right? So we can look at air toxins that are cancerous. Here's Bakersfield. I'm so sorry, Visalia, right? So this tells you what their index of cancer risk is. We can look at indices of lead paint. This is especially true in older homes. Superfund sites, where did the trash go or who has major pollution? We can look at Superfund sites. Also Bakersfield, I'm just saying Bakersfield. If you're from Bakersfield, look, I hope looking at these maps is not making you like freak out. Hazardous waste proximities, Santa Maria, a little bit in San Luis Obispo. We can look at pollution sources. We can look at diesel particulate matters. We can look at air toxic cancer risks. Yay, California. We can look at traffic proximity because here's 101, here is 5, here is the 99, right? So if you're living next to 101, you're increasing your traffic proximity. We can look at socioeconomic factors. So we unclick that. We can look at low income. Where are the low income people? Now I want you to think about, we talked about that great flood. What happens if the Central Valley floods again, right? Who can recover? Who has the finances to recover? People over the age of 65, yeah, San Luis Obispo is a major retirement community, mostly from people in the Bay Area, but those higher populations of 65 and over can be a real impact. We can look at health disparities like heart disease. We can look at asthma. Yeah, turn off overage. So this is a great resource. So once you're done graduating and you're considering moving to somewhere, you might want to throw down and say, where are the places I need to be looking at and what are my health risks as I'm moving there? So some of the impacts of environmental injustice, we have health problems that correlate with asthma, obesity, lead poisoning, cancers, diabetes, mental health issues, right? Living in a toxic community is definitely linked to mental health issues and developmental problems. We see in these communities, there's an inadequate access to healthcare. That is both an urban and a rural problem. Rural communities have serious lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to safe play spaces. Like kids need to get out and run around, and a lot of places don't have access to that. Absence of good jobs, heightened crime, violence, domestic violence, and voter suppression, right? How do you make sure your voice is heard? You vote. That's how you make sure your voice is heard. You vote and you run for something. All right, so we can look at this as a global phenomena as well. This is air pollution, right? This is a huge issue in a lot of places. We zoom in here, right? The darker colors, look how bad the air pollution is in places like Bangladesh and in India. So yeah. So yeah, you can look at this and you can see the disproportionate impacts of the globe. And of course, richer countries are creating most of the climate change issues and have benefited from most of the progress of progressing during the industrial age. And so we have to figure out how to go to countries and be able to go, let us help you progress. So you also are coming up, giving them a vote without adding to climate change. Less wealthy countries, those still developing, are often suffering the most from climate change. And a lot of them have a long history with colonialism that has created a whole bunch of other issues. And I'm gonna have you watch Climate Change Will Displace Millions. Here's how we prepare. So there are serious issues around eco injustice, and it's about looking at what are the systems in play, what are the obstacles and barriers that we have put in place intentionally or that have been there in a latent way, and how do we get rid of them so we can have a healthier future globally? Because what happens in India, what happens in Bangladesh, the pollutants that go into those oceans don't stay there. They come here. We are connected in a single planet, and there's no planet B. We're not making it to Mars in time. We're not going to colonize the moon in time. Climate change is here, and we have to figure out how to clean this mess up now, and we have to figure out how to do it in a way that helps everyone in equitable and equal manners. All right, everybody, you have a great day.